And it is a kind of touch. Hearing is touch.
Yeah.
But it's just transduced in a bizarre and really cool way.
That's fascinating.
I can't think of any more human activity than conducting science experiments.
The game I play is a very interesting one. It's imagination in a tight straitjacket.
The beauty of a living thing is not the atoms that go into it, but the way those atoms are put together.
What I always think should be the basis of education is not answers but questions. We should teach kids how to question.
Well, today on the show we have Tara Hamilton, who's recently been appointed as Associate Professor at Macquarie University.
Yep.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. How are you finding it there?
It's great, yeah. The food options are better.
Yeah? Oh, that's awesome.
No, that's true, isn't it?
So you were at Western Sydney before. What campus were you
I
on
was
there?
on Kingswood, and then we moved to Warrington, and Warrington is sort of like tumbleweeds.
Yeah.
There's lots of kangaroos.
Yeah.
That's all I can say for it.
I heard kangaroo meat tastes real delicious.
Yeah, there was a few PhD students that were driving around trying to knock them over.
Yeah, we were there the other night at the observatory, and we saw heaps of kangaroos. It's kind of nice, joeys and things like that as well.
Yeah, no, it's cool.
So let's start with your journey. What got you interested in science? Is this even recorded? Yeah. What got you interested in science? Did you have some sort of role models that kind of pushed you into this path, or did you, look at TV shows and pop culture that influenced you into this path? What was it for you?
For me, I mean, we had a big backyard growing up, and so I just spent lots of time dissecting snails and things. And
Wow.
I think that just sort of, I just had this inquiring kind of mind that just was always, kind of, I still do it now. I was doing it with my kids yesterday, just sitting on the grass, watching what's alive down there and following it and seeing what's going on. And and I love Lego. So I think Lego coupled with, just loving how does something work? That's,
Wait, I just have to say, okay, first of all, Alex used to dissect shit all the time when he was a little kid. But second of all, it's interesting because when we went to your team meeting when you were at WSU, that whole group deals with neuromorphic engineering, and right there at its foundation you have Legos, which kind of is like engineering, right?
And biology.
that's it. Yeah, so it was predestined, I think.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, my son's really into Lego as well, and something we both probably missed out on was Minecraft when we were growing up, and he's gotten right into that now. It's just
my kids are only small, but I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, mine are only 2.5, but
You say that, I was looking forward to it too. I'm like, I've got to get them into Minecraft. It's going to be so great. And now I can't even get them to do their homework, and it's a massive issue. They're on it 24/7. It's crazy. Yeah.
Speaking about Minecraft, my little nephew, he's about 6, and he watches these videos of people playing Minecraft on YouTube, and now he's got an American accent.
Oh, really? Yeah, I've heard that one from parents before, just watching Sesame Street.
Yeah. It's the American kind of culture is taking over.
Indoctrinating our children. What do we do? So you had this interest ever since you were a child. How did this get developed as you grew older?
I'm old enough to have had teachers that aren't, have their hands tied by NAPLAN and things. So my teachers, fairly early on, when I was in year 3, year 4, recognized that I was a little bit different. And in third grade, it was when Halley's Comet was flying over, and I was really into it for the whole year. And Halley's Comet, everything. So that whole year, the artwork, Halley's Comet, the teacher would just let me do Halley's Comet all year.
Yeah.
I don't even know what else happened. I don't know what the class was doing. I just did Halley's Comet all year. So I was kind of lucky to sort of have the kind of freedom to explore what I was interested in at school, and I think that's really important for kids. And yeah, for me that just helped me be comfortable with the fact that I was a bit of a nerd, and embrace my inner nerd. And yeah.
It's really important, like how much teachers can influence people.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
Giving, like when a teacher recognizes a skill or a passion in
Yeah.
a student, they really give them the means to kind of
to
explore that. It can
it,
change
yeah.
their whole life.
I know. I think it did. Yeah, something as sort of at such a young age, but I think it had a huge influence on just. I mean, it taught me how to be a researcher in year 3. I don't know how old that is. What is that? Like
It's
9 years old, 8 years old. Yeah.
Like that, yeah.
So yeah, it was pretty influential for what
So
was
did you?
happening.
Oh, sorry.
Before you go, it's interesting because the education system kind of like worked out for you, right?
Yes, it did.
Whereas we had
Lisa,
Lisa Harvey Smith,
Yeah.
who was homeschooled because when she was doing when she went to high school, they would get the girls to do all like the typical stereotypical girl things and the guys to do the and she found that it hindered her.
Oh, it
And
would, yeah.
I don't know how common. I think I would hope that all teachers, when they see students like just obsess about one thing and want to like just learn about something rather than stifling it and saying, "Oh, learn this stuff." You have to learn this other stuff.
Yeah.
They kind of like feed that dragon and let it like.
Yeah. Especially when you're so young as well. Like, it's not like
Yeah.
you're going to miss out on anything too super important.
Yeah, exactly
Yeah.
right.
And children are naturally inquisitive, so
Yeah.
it's like really important to
Yeah.
kind of like drive that. I
They're,
think
they're scientists when they come out, and I think
Yeah.
the education system beats it out of them.
you got to learn this. You got to
Yeah.
learn this.
Stop
Yeah.
thinking.
Yeah.
Stop being
Yeah,
curious.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting.
So
So was there a time? I'm assuming that kind of drove your passion into engineering and science. Was there a time when you decided to become a researcher, or was that like very early on as well? Like,
no, not at all.
Yeah.
So I went to. So it's interesting you talk about high school. I went to an all-girls school, which I think has a different dynamic in terms of I was terrible at the sewing and the cooking. I really was bad.
through that as well.
Yeah, I was awful at it, and so I remember I got in trouble because I kind of paid a friend to do my sewing project for me. But that sort of let me kind of do my maths and that sort of thing. But actually at high school I was really into economics and drama and yeah, I didn't know what I was going to do. And so being an engineer wasn't actually, like for the HSC I did maths, English, drama and economics. I didn't actually do any sciences.
Oh wow.
And so, yeah, like when I got to the end of it, it was sort of like, now what am I going to do? And I got a scholarship from Sydney Electricity, which was Energy Australia, which is now Ausgrid, and that decided it. I'm going to do electrical engineering.
Yeah.
So it wasn't even something I was necessarily passionate about at the start. I was always passionate about finding out how things worked, but it didn't matter what that thing was. And then, yeah, I didn't want to be a researcher. I finished my undergrad and went and worked for Cochlea that make the bionic ears.
Yeah.
And I worked there for 5 years, and that's such a full of really interesting people that know lots of stuff. And it sort of, as time went by, I realized how little I knew about biology and how much I wanted to know about biology. So I went back and did a master's at UNSW in biomedical engineering. And then that was it. Like, the flame had been lit, and I just wanted to know more about everything. And then I decided to do a PhD. But it was a very,
Zigzaggy, yeah.
I have an interesting similar parallel story because I didn't do any science in my HSC either.
Right, yeah.
And I was kind of like took this music option, and I was attending music undergrad at Western Sydney when I first left high school, and but then like jobs in music, so I was kind of like, I need some like day job to get by, and then kind of diverged into like lab tech, and then did a like TAFE course, and then I progress in that field a bit. I'll go to uni, and then you get bitten by like that research bug, and you just change the whole course of my life.
You don't expect to be where you end up, but
It's interesting how it works out like that. But that's really cool. So you found out that you didn't know much about biology. How is that, accumulating that knowledge and combining it with your engineering knowledge, how has that kind of shaped you as a person?
I think like my thing is that everything is actually the same. We just all talk different. Like, if you look at physics, it has a particular vernacular around physics, and so they use particular words to describe things. But the same things are actually happening in biology, but we do use different words to describe that. And most of the time, it's just a language problem more than anything else. Because when I started doing sort of clinical laboratory science and stuff, I realized how similar some of the problems were to engineering, like electrical engineering problems or something like that, but it was just phrased differently, and it was in a different, obviously a different vessel. But it was very similar kind of problems. So I found, like, I've always really sucked badly at chemistry because it doesn't sort of fit that mathematical framework. But everything that fits a mathematical framework, I feel like I'm quite comfortable with it, and I can just, flip over. So
Just, can you give us an example? Because Alex and I will kind of think like having the conversation along the same lines of what you're saying, but give us an example of similarities that you say that you saw in these different fields.
Okay, so I guess I'm a neuromorphic engineering, so one of the classics is just how neurons communicate, and there's a protocol there, and there's sort of information theory, and there's like little packets, and you need to have a insulated, you need the myelin sheath around it, otherwise you have Alzheimer's or something terrible, and that you have to insulate wires in your computer, otherwise it's chaos in there. So it's really, it's the systems are kind of the same. You're transporting information from different, the way we've set up the system, like a computing system, is quite different. But in terms of like, if you get down to the individual transistors, the differences are, like a transistor is basically an ion channel, and so, and the mathematics are the same, ion channel and transistor. So like that's kind of the classic neuromorphic example of how our communication, our electrical communication system in our brains or in our nervous systems generally is so similar to the things that we build, and microphones, your computers and things.
That's
Before you go, I was just going to build on that thought. So Alex and I were in the car the other day. We finished teaching, and we're just talking, and they're like, we're talking about how he was talking about some article in the MRes that some student, I don't know, was talking about or whatever, about how metaphors are so important for science. And what they kind of like bring out and make apparent is that there are these patterns that we see in the universe repeating at different scales. Things like messenger RNA or messenger molecules. Well, the reason why we call them messenger molecules in the first place is because there's something analogous to that at a bigger scale, and that thing might exist even at like in physics. The interactions between like two electrons. The photons that get passed on from one electron to another. Maybe it's messenger as well. It's like the same patterns you see over and over and over again. And like you're saying, it's like a different language game. It's a different sort of frame that we're looking at it, but the patterns are exactly the same.
Absolutely, yeah. And once you realize that, you realize how it's all kind of accessible to you then, because I don't claim to be an expert in anything particular, but I can get my head around it, and I can read a paper and I can go, oh, that's really similar to that, and then it all makes sense to me, and it really helps crystallize concepts.
To go back, because you gave the example before about the transistor, but perhaps another example of this is neural networks. And we've had quite a few guests on who have talked about neural networks, but we haven't ever really just broken down what a neural network is and how it is kind of analogous to biological systems. Would you like to?
Take a shot. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's funny. Neural networks is really buzz now with deep learning and stuff.
Yeah.
But, like I learned them back, early 2000s when they weren't as cool because we didn't have the computing power.
Yeah.
But the basic sort of idea about neural networks is all about parallel computation, and it's all about having individual neurons that take little chunks of information, and together they can, we can use mathematics to kind of see what the pattern is at the end. So in our brains, one neuron probably isn't doing that much, but a collection of neurons working together, that's what gives us our signal. So sometimes it's all about sometimes it's about the technicalities of signal to noise, the fact that you have a lot of stochasticity in your inputs. And so then you need a lot of little units in order to translate that. In neural networks, because we don't necessarily have the noise that we do in our biological systems, a lot of the little nodes are all about transforming that information, and if you sort of do a mathematical transformation on information, you can start to separate different things and find patterns. And it's a very similar concept to what's going on in the brain, in that we're getting lots of information and it's all somehow combining, and part of that is just because we're doing all these transformations, we're using a lot of populations of neurons in order to both spread the information out, so it's like statistics almost, but also allows us to see when we've got temporal similarities, neurons that fire together, wire together, and so you're able to actually say, hey, this thing's related to this thing, and that same sort of concept is certainly becoming quite prevalent in the artificial networks that we're making.
Yeah.
So are they trying to replicate the randomness that biology has in neural networks?
I don't think they're doing enough, because I think the randomness is really important, because a lot of the problem with the deep networks and things that you find is that they're kind of overtrained for the task, whereas like general intelligence will come from being able to generalize concepts. And part of what's nice about having noise is that it allows you to kind of spread your signal a bit and look at the statistics of your input and how they relate, rather than this is the, like if you look on YouTube, like dog faces, like, you could kind of tailor a system that does it really well, but if you throw it a cat, it sort of freaks out, it's, oh, that's a dog too, or just anything that you haven't trained it with, and that's because it doesn't really have that generalizable intelligence. And I think part of that is because like our brain does it well because it's just so used to dealing with like noisy signals.
Oh, that's so it almost seems analogous, and correct me if I'm mistaken. So the randomness in the signal or the noise in it, actually, it's almost like the mutations that organisms kind of experience that allow them to adapt to the environment. Whereas, like, if you take away that randomness, then they become so specialized in one niche environment that as soon as you change the environment, they freak out and die.
It also sounds like a bit of a trade-off, isn't it? Because then you've got, if you train a system, it'll do the job well straight away, and it'll do the job exactly what you want, but then it won't be able to cope very well with these differences.
Exactly,
or if you let it learn, I think, which is what you're alluding to, by making mistakes and kind of growing, it might have a more generalized intelligence, but I guess it probably takes longer.
Exactly, yeah, and that's the thing that I think everybody's grappling with now. Like, the artificial intelligence is good in very niche things that we've trained it on, but if you want really true artificial intelligence, you really need to kind of let it go and let it learn for itself, which is extraordinarily scary, in a way, because we're not exactly sure how these things work, So, yes, that's how Skynet got created.
I was just about to say that. That is incredibly scary, because if you develop an artificial intelligence system that is going to be faster or smarter than us, then it probably wants to get out. It probably wants to start doing shit that that is in conflict with our interests. And what if it decides to just kill everyone to do whatever, I don't know, to save the Earth because its own like survival is contingent on the survival of the
Isn't
Earth.
there a
Isn't that Dolores?
There's a there's
Oh, we have a Westworld fan.
there's the idea of the Paperclip Maximizer as well. Like
Yes.
you build a machine that is to make paper clips, and it's an artificial intelligence, and it decides the best way to make paper clips is to convert every single molecule in the universe into a paper clip, and that includes humans, right? So there's always those unintended risks that you're not sure,
You're not
right? All I
sure,
want to do
yeah.
is make an AI that builds the most paper clips possible,
Yes.
but then it like takes off, gets super intelligence, and
Yeah.
decides the best way to do that is to exterminate every yeah.
Maybe we can transition into what. So you mentioned the cochlea.
Yep.
Tell us about that. And
Because a lot of your past colleagues in Western Sydney were developing systems that looked at like insect eyes and trying to engineer electronic systems that mimic those types of processes.
Yep.
Because there's lots of benefits that we can kind of see in biology that we can translate into engineering.
Yep.
So your work's focused a little bit more on the ear in that respect, or
It has. So my PhD was modelling the cochlea, which was a kind of obvious step for someone that spent 5 years working at Cochlea.
Yeah.
Although afterwards I was really sick of the cochlea. But yeah. So I mean, the ear is an amazing organ in terms. I mean, it's basically, its purpose is to improve signal to noise ratio. Like everything about it is and it does it in quite an interesting way. Like other kinds of sort of sensory systems are kind of, there's sort of neurons in my finger. Well, there's nerves in my finger, and they're right under there, and whereas the ear, it does all this pre-processing stuff, which is kind of.
Do you want to break that down a bit for us? Like,
Yeah.
how does the ear work?
So you've got sound is basically a wave that's vibrating our eardrum. And then there's this mechanical system. So there's these three little bones that transduce that into basically it's a pulling and a pushing motion on a little little plunger thing, which holds the fluid of the cochlea. So the cochlea is filled with fluid, and as this pressure wave gets transduced into it, there's a membrane inside it, and the membrane is, again, it's mechanical. So at the beginning of the membrane, it's quite inflexible and stiff, and then by the time you get to the end of it, it's a lot more flexible. So the beginning part of the cochlea really responds well to high frequencies, and the end part responds really well to low frequencies. And it's kind of, I think just for packing reasons, it's sort of it's snail shaped.
Yeah.
It's very small. And then inside, on that membrane, you have these little, what we call hair cells, but basically when they get vibrated, depending on where they are on the cochlea, on the basilar membrane, they open ion channels, which then connect, which basically transduce everything mechanical into an electrical signal, and then connect to the rest of your auditory nerve.
Yeah, it's a fascinating system, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you've got this like pressure wave kind of coming in from outside, and that pressure wave could be at different frequencies. So with those really high frequencies that we hear and the really low frequencies, and then that pressure wave is moving the bone. I think you just described it as, what was it, a suction?
Yeah, it's like a little plunger thing.
Yeah, plunger,
It's sort of-
yeah.
So the bones are kind of moving this.
And that's pushing the fluid, is it?
Yeah. So then that creates a wave within the cochlea.
Yeah.
So that fluid is like a kind of a salty fluid.
Yeah.
That it itself also has. There's a lot going on in there.
Yeah.
But it sort of has. There's different ionic concentrations between above the basilar membrane and behind. So it actually
Interesting.
is a battery as well.
Yeah.
So it's sort of self-powering.
Wow.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
nuts. Yeah.
so the plunging effect, that movement powers these cells? What do you mean battery?
So
That's-
wasn't it? Sorry.
It
So the plunger moves the fluid in the ear,
Yeah.
and then that hits the membrane, which these hairs stick on. If it's a high frequency that came in, it moves it, I guess, a little bit,
Yep.
and then hits the membrane and the hair early, and that hair moves and converts the signal into a high frequency that we hear.
Yep.
But maybe we can get back onto that battery part, because
Yeah.
that sounds really fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I wouldn't say that it powers it necessarily, but it gives you a potential difference that kind of allows for that ion transport across the basilar membrane.
So this is an electrical difference, a
Yeah.
difference in charge.
Yeah. So it's kind of really cool that it's sort of, it sort of creates its own conditions in order to do that transduction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Okay, so that's fascinating. So you did some work on the cochlea. Now, how is that related to engineering? Can you link those two up, please?
No, I cannot. I guess the cochlea has been, it's sort of, as described, it's an interesting mechanical electrical system.
Yeah.
So I guess part of the engineering was just trying to understand how that would work and whether it was feasible to build. So my PhD was building it in silicon. So my job at Cochlea, the company, was as a chip designer. So I wanted to do a chip design PhD. So the main idea was to try to understand these mechanical and electrical interactions and develop a model so that I could put it in circuits onto a chip and perhaps use that as a kind of a funky front end to a hearing system of some sort.
Yeah, so I guess that direct benefit then is obviously for hearing. Are there any other types of benefits between?
I sort of have since discovered that the kind of mathematics behind how the cochlea works is related to lots and lots of other things. As we kind of alluded to before, there's so much the same thing, the same sort of patterns in all sorts of systems, but it's quite related to like superconducting materials and things like that. So I guess some of the work that I have done can translate quite, especially the mathematics behind it, because it's a really difficult system. Like, people have approximated the cochlea using filters and things, but actually it's probably a coupled oscillator system, which is really, really hard to mathematically get your head around, especially if you assume all the oscillators are coupled to one another, which they are in the Cochlear model, although they are more coupled with their sort of adjacent oscillators, but they are all connected together. So it's a really difficult mathematical problem and an interesting system, because there are these coupled oscillator models in kind of biology all over the place.
Can you just describe what a coupled oscillators are? Yeah.
Okay, so they
I kind of got lost.
yeah. So sorry. So an oscillator, I guess. What's a good oscillator example?
Something that repeats over and over, right? An oscillator.
So I'm trying to think of something that. I guess if you think about pendulums is a good one.
Yeah.
So if you have two pendulums together, I think this is like a classic. Galileo noticed this while he was sitting in church, right? So if you have a pendulum and another pendulum, and they're kind of coupled across maybe they're sitting on a wooden plank, eventually they'll start oscillating together. They'll synchronize. So that's a synchronized oscillator idea, but it's the idea that you've got two systems that can, I guess, beat or create a rhythm, and they're joined together somehow. So like the kind of classic Galileo idea is mechanical. So you've got pendulums or metronomes, say metronomes and a plank of wood, and if you put two metronomes on there, they'll eventually sync up just through the kind of very weak coupling, but that coupling through the wood will make them kind of synchronize.
So does the energy from one transfer to the other through that connection?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So in the cochlea, there's energy transfer in that fluid. So I tried to incorporate that by building a sort of an electrical fluid, so that you could have, if this oscillator is resonating. So if a sound comes in that's perfect for this particular hair cell and it just goes woo, that connects to the oscillators around it, so that they sort of start to resonate a little bit too.
And what is the point? Is that to amplify the signal?
Yes, yeah. So, as I said before, the whole point of the cochlea is to try to maximize its signal to noise ratio. So one of the ways that it does it is that if it's a very faint sound, not only do you get an increase in the gain in your cochlea, which is partially because of this coupling between adjacent little oscillators, but you also get more specificity. So it starts rejecting other frequencies. And that's why if you're in a really quiet room, like an anechoic chamber or something, your ears start to ring, and it's because your ears are like tuning themselves up to like hear everything, and ends up kind of creating its own kind of...
Oh, I thought I was just getting old and getting like...
No, you are. But is there also a dulling effect?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it can dampen as well. So and this is another reason why the coupled behavior is kind of interesting. So if it's very loud, you'll get a very damped response, and your ear will try to reject as much of it as possible.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
So this amplification of the signal, does that also mean that we can't distinguish between the frequencies as well, because hairs surrounding that particular hair are also being activated?
My model showed, at its speed, showed by measuring, I think, chinchillas, which are kind of interesting little fuzzballs, but that the best frequency is at static, so they actually change their best frequency. So everybody kind of gets together and changes exactly where their best frequency is to do the best job they can for the frequency that they need to sort of zoom in on.
Well, so the hair cells themselves change the frequencies that they are tuned to.
Yeah.
So that you don't get confused what frequencies are. Oh, that's so cool.
How does a hair cell change what frequency it's tuned to?
Well, that's kind of the big question. Some of it is because of the mechanics of the system. Because I'm not exactly sure. I built it and it did this, and I was like, cool, that looks like the chinchilla.
Yeah.
Please give me a PhD. But yes, I'm not exactly sure what I feel like it's happening in the mechanical domain, whether it's some sort of the oscillator system, because it's mainly in the mechanical domain, and the hair cell is kind of the output.
Yeah.
It just, I send an ion and off we go in electrical land. So I feel like it's the mechanical system that's somehow being changed. There's this organocorty that sits on the basilar membrane, which is where the outer hair cells are. So there's inner hair cells, which have they're like a spectrum analyzer, and they just divide everything up into frequencies. The outer hair cells are really the bit that's giving us the tuned behavior and the kind of automatic gain control. Yeah, sorry. So those outer hair cells are the things that are changing the best frequency and changing the amplitude.
Yeah.
And they're kind of embedded into another membrane called the Tectorial Membrane, and so there's a lot to unpack from the biology of it, and I don't claim to be an expert on that part of it. I kind of, part of being an engineer, and we kind of always say this as engineers, we're not interested in getting everything right, we're just interested in getting something working.
Yeah.
The scientist in me wants to understand it all, but the engineering me goes, this is the system mathematically that I want to replicate, and I did that. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. And I think that's why it's still so heavily studied, because it's a really interesting system that isn't like anything else. It's everything else is sort of quite similar. And it is a kind of touch. Hearing is touch.
Yeah.
But it's just transduced in a bizarre and really cool way.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So what are you researching at the moment? Are you still working on
any plans? So
I'm researching where to put my desk in my new
Can I write a PhD on
mapping
that?
where the sun comes in.
Try to get the best sort of lighting for the whole day. At the moment, let's see what's on the books. I'm sort of trying to get a postdoc to come over, and because we're at Macquarie, there's a lot of hearing research there, so we're
cool.
sort of looking at a couple of things to do with cochlear implants and improving them, especially when you've got 2 cochlear implants. So binaural hearing is something that's quite difficult to achieve. And part of it is technological, and part of it is that we just don't understand how our ears synchronize and connect up with each other. And there's sort of lots of theories out there, but when you try to actually replicate them, they don't do as well as you'd think. That, something simple like sound localization is actually quite difficult if you follow what is generally understood to be happening. And so it suggests that there's some other things going on there. So he's been working for a long time in the States with cochlear implant users, and so we're hoping to bring some of that here to Sydney and maybe look at some technological, like working with patients and then translating it.
So that sound localization, from what I remember from my physiology days, so there's a few different mechanisms that they think are involved, right? The shape of the ear is one of it, but also I think the timing, isn't it? When the
between one ear and the other, is it?
Yeah. So there's this model called Jeffers model, which it's basically it basically says there's a cross correlation between the 2 ears, and you're looking for a time difference, so interneural time delays between the 2 ears, which kind of makes sense, except that if you kind of plot it out, given our head size, we probably don't have very good, we don't have very good sound localization across where we want it. So there must be some other mechanisms. Now, some people say there's interoral level differences. So I hear something louder over here and softer over here. So that might be it. And there's also some other models which suggest that it might be looking at phase differences in when the sound wave comes in, and that's kind of what some insects do. So they're too small to be able to localize because they've got such small heads. So they basically do a destruction or an additive. Basically they just add the wave that's coming to them, and they work out. If it's coming from right in front, then they're going to add, or if it's coming from, right over here, then they're going to subtract. So you can work out which way the sound is coming from just by doing phase cancellation.
So that's like when the sound waves are slightly out of alignment, and they can use that misalignment or alignment, whichever it happens to be, to
work out which way. Rather than relying on a timing difference, because for a little insect, the timing difference is ridiculously fast compared to how fast a neuron can fire and how big your head is. So
it sounds like a new great neuromorphic engineering project for someone. Yeah.
So I'm guessing you're taking on research students as well.
Yes.
I think Macquarie also has a Master of Research program similar to Western Sydney.
They do.
I think they launched it 6 months before the one over here, and so I was actually going to either choose to go here or over there, and one of my friends went over there. So it's pretty cool. Okay, so what projects would you have available besides the one with the postdoc? Do you have anything else that...
I mean, anything really. I've been doing, obviously, anything with neuromorphic hearing, even if you're interested in insects here. If you look at my CV, I do projects of whatever the student's interested in rather than what I'm interested in.
That's awesome. Yeah.
I prefer to have a student that's really engaged in what they're doing. So I've been involved with all sorts of crazy stuff, and it's fine because I learn something, and I try to be supportive of I don't like the academic pyramid scheme where you end up being lord of one thing, and then everyone must bow to your greatness. So it's so sad, and I think it's sort of a lot of good students get ferried into doing projects they're not passionate about.
Yeah. Well, this gets back to what you were saying before about encouraging people's passions and their curiosity and not kind of quelling that.
And I think that should continue through now. I will always try to get in co-supervisors or whatever to support it if I don't have a background that's too solid. But I'll always, you just come to me, you tell me what you're interested in, and we will find a project. We'll find money, we'll find a project, because that's what I like to do.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a really fun conversation, Tara. And anyone who wants to get in contact with Tara should just look her up on Google.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be too hard to find you at all. And if you're a researcher, I mean, come on, you should be able to do it. Right?
Me having Google Scholar.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you again for being on the podcast. We really had a lot of fun.
Thank you.